All right, okay. So, in writing, there is this idea of the rule of three. Have you heard of it? Yeah, Avni, you know what it is? So, it's this, like in a good story and so on, things come in threes, right? So, so Goldilocks goes and, one porridge is too hot, the next one is too cold, and the third one is just right. Then, what Russian folk tales, right? The first brother is too strong, and the second one is too rude, and the third one is kind and wise, right? So, so there are all these rules of threes, and I guess like what it does is, there's with all of these, if you think of it, there's a sense of an ending, right? Things are wrapping up. So, that's what I plan to do in this session. I just want to wrap up our discussion from the previous two sessions. Okay, so that's the goal. So just a reminder again, we are looking at this one specific context, but talking about some ideas that are applicable in other contexts as well. So we talked about birdsong, and we remain within discussions about birdsong, but some of the ideas that we talked about, like networks that keep time, or looking at modeling sequences in general, these are slightly more widely applicable. Okay, so we had these first two sessions, and today I just want to tie these two together and say, okay, so you have models here, a different set of models here, and how do the two models inform each other, and then just some questions about if you have a model, then how do you tell if it is a reasonable model or not. Okay, so just some of these questions we'll try and address. I also wanted you to just take a minute to think about these two levels. Okay, so there is the neural model, and then there is a probabilistic model, right? And one of them is a mechanistic model. Okay, so you want to know, how are these neural spikes generated, how are things wired in such a way that you see this kind of behavior in these neural networks, right? So that is a mechanistic model. The probabilistic model is a phenomenological model, okay, which is you're looking at this behavior and you're looking at statistical regularities, you're looking at the patterns, and it's really at the level of description, right? So one is there is a focus on process, and the other there is a focus on description of patterns. Okay, so you can think of them as models at two levels of abstraction, and so together they allow us to bridge the notion of implementation and behavior. Okay, so that's maybe one way of thinking about these models. All right, so what did we say about the neural model so far? In the case of songbirds, so we talked about how songbirds have these learned songs, and depending on what bird you're looking at, these songs can be very deterministic, or you can have stochastic song. So there is interest in understanding how are these song sequences generated, what drives these song sequences, etc. We talked about how in songbirds we know that there is, from the 1970s, it's known that there is specialized circuitry, neural circuitry for both the learning and the production of song. We looked at one important experiment where this region HVC was recorded from in a zebra finch which has deterministic song, and they looked at these precisely timed spikes of HVC RA projection neurons. And the idea was, what sort of models could generate this kind of precisely timed spikes, resulting in sequential behavior. And we said that, one architecture that we could look at is the Sinfire chain. So the Sinfire chain has groups of neurons arranged in pools. They make all-to-all excitatory connections, and the idea is that you have a volley of spikes that propagates from one pool to the other, and that propagation is what you think of, just like a metronome, something that goes tick, 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 and keeps time for the sequences that are being generated. And to just think about the neural architecture, we used simple leaky integrate and fire neuron model, just talked a little bit about what that model looks like and use that to think about this architecture. So that's what we did. So if you have deterministic song, like this is the song of, I mean, a representation of the song of the zebra finch, you would think of each syllable in the song as being represented by a chain, okay, by a Sinfire chain here. And these different pools or different chains, activity propagates from one chain to another, and that's how you have, you know, and then this drives downstream areas and you have song production, okay. We also talked about if you have more complex songs, so if you have songs of the Bengalese finch, where, you know, actually the bird kind of mixes syllables together, so some syllables follow some others with greater probability and so on, then, you know, we think of a branching Sinfire chain. So we think of this architecture and that, you know, probabilistic transitions between these different chains is what, yeah, what would drive probabilistic behavior as well. Yeah. Yeah. So, so the idea has to be that you have activity propagating here, and then selectively either C has to get activated or B has to get activated, right? And typically the way, I mean, there are many ways to get that to happen. What is done usually is there is a pool of inhibitory neurons, and then this first layer in each of these chains is connected to that pool. When one gets activated, yeah, the other is suppressed. Okay, so I think some of you were asking me, like, are there other architectures that can also keep time, right? So there are other Sinfire chains are one possibility. So in fact, there is more recent work saying that, you know, maybe you don't need Sinfire chains, or perhaps all you need is that here, so that the signals arrive at the same time in one pool or one chain, okay, but maybe where the signals are coming from could be, they need not be synchronous. So the input need not be synchronous, it could be asynchronous, but as long as the arrival times of the spikes are synchronous. So these are called polychronous chains, okay. So the presynaptic timing, you don't have these synchronous volleys, it could be asynchronous, but the arrival in a pool is synchronous. So there are other network architectures also. Beyond this, I mean, you could think of, you know, what other ways are there of keeping time in neural networks, okay. But I just wanted to address that there is work, more recent work, maybe saying that perhaps it's not Sinfire chains, there could be other possibilities as well. Okay, then we moved on in the second tutorial to think about the probabilistic models. And specifically we looked at the hidden Markov model and the Baum-Welch algorithm to infer the hidden Markov model. So just as a quick reminder, what are the parameters of the hidden Markov model? So you have to specify a set of states, these are hidden, okay, and then each state can emit one of, you know, a finite number of symbols, okay. So there are states, hidden states, and there are symbols. There's transition, you can transition between these states, and every time you transition to a state, one of these symbols gets emitted with some probability, okay. So there is from, this is important here, that from each state you can emit each of the symbols in a hidden Markov model, okay. And we also said that you can represent this using a transition matrix between the states. So if we had to take this example, you would have a 2 by 2 matrix and all of the probabilities of transitioning between those states. You also have an emission matrix, which would basically tell you how each state with what probability does it emit a symbol. So in this example, you would have a 2 by 3 matrix, okay. And you'd also have an initial state distribution. Once we specified what this model looks like, we then talked about how, given a bunch of sequences or given a sequence, an observation sequence, how do you actually infer the parameters of the model. So that was the goal of the Baum-Welch algorithm, which is to estimate these parameters, the transition matrix, the emission matrix, and the initial distribution, given you have some observed data. and we worked through this algorithm in the last tutorial. Okay, so just as again a quick reminder of what we did, you start with some initial model, right, like you pick random transition probabilities, and then there are two steps. There's an expectation step and then a maximization step. For the expectation step, if you recall, we had the forward backward algorithm. So we calculated the forward probabilities, which is the probability of seeing the observation sequence up to a point t, up to time t, and the state at time t being something, and this conditional probability, which is the backward probability. From these two, we were also able to calculate the probability of state occupancy and state transition. And we discussed how these are, you can think of these as the expected number of times you see the state, and also the expected number of times you see a transition given that you are in a particular state. So you could use these to update the parameters. So in the maximization step, remember you want to recalculate transition probabilities, emission probabilities, and the initial state distribution. So using these, we had an update step for each of these parameters. And then the idea was that you would iterate. The way you would get to an optimal HMM is that you would iterate these steps and keep track of the log likelihood, right, the probability of seeing the observation sequence given the model, and go on till it converges. Okay. So this was what we worked through last time. So what are some things to keep in mind? So the algorithm, the Baum-Welch algorithm, guarantees a non-decreasing likelihood. It converges to a local optimum. Okay, so you're not guaranteed that you'll get the global optimum. It converges to a local optimum. Last time, I think Gyanshri, who was here, asked about this. So you need to do some scaling, because if you see in calculating these probabilities, you're multiplying a whole bunch of really small numbers. Okay, so you actually have to. There is a scaling step at every stage, which is required for numerical stability. This is something that you can look up. And then this is important to our discussion going forward today. For all of this to happen, the form of the hidden Markov model is assumed to be known. So what this means is you actually know that there are this many states, right? What the number of states is, you kind of have to assume that for that initial model, right? You need to know how many states are there, and then which syllables are perhaps assigned to, well, let me not go there yet, but you need to know the number of states in the model. And this need not always be possible, right? So for the example that Aishwarya gave, there were 4 sleep stages, and it was known. So she was working with those 4 sleep stages being the hidden states, right? So you knew how many you had to work with. With the weather example, we knew sunny and rainy. So there were 2 states that we were looking for, and so we knew that as well. But let's say you think of the bird song example, you actually don't know the number of states that are resulting in the syllables that you see. So you don't know the form of the HMM. Okay. So let's maybe discuss, what that could mean, and how could we then figure out how many states there are in the model. This is actually not an easy problem in any context. If you don't know the number of states there are, to infer the number of hidden states is actually quite hard. Okay. The other thing I wanted to say is that there are variations on the HMM which may be more suitable for specific contexts, like the one that we are discussing right now. So in the regular HMM, every state actually gives rise to potentially any of the symbols, right? Any of the output symbols each state can give rise to. Okay, each state can emit all of the symbols, but this is a partially observable Markov model. So the difference here, I showed you this last time, but we didn't. We just like quickly glossed over it, right? So in this case, if you take a look at these 2 states, okay, so these are the hidden states, right? The output is A, but there are 2 hidden states, 1 and 5. Here you have only one syllable or one output, one symbol associated with each of the states. Okay. So, and you want this. So, in the case of mapping the neural model and the probabilistic model in the case of birdsong, since each chain, each neural chain actually is a syllable, that is the state in the system, we want each chain to only emit one syllable. Okay. So, that is a reasonable way to think about whether we want a hidden Markov model or a partially observable Markov model. It is biologically more plausible, or like it relates well with the neural model that we have, that each chain emits one symbol, and therefore you think of each one state being mapped to one symbol. Okay. But of course, there is a many to one mapping between the states and the symbol. So, multiple states can give rise to the same symbol, which is what makes it different from a Markov model, a simple first order Markov model, in which there is a one-to-one mapping between states and symbols. Here there is a many-to-one mapping between states and symbols, but each state there is no one-to-many mapping between states and symbols. Okay. Hopefully that is all right. Okay. So, in the partially observable Markov model, so again states not observable, these are the syllables. So, the transition matrix and the emission matrix in this case would look like this. The emission matrix would have just ones and zeros. So, you ask this state which symbol does it emit. So, 5 emits symbol A, and so that is a 1. Right. So, that is what the emission matrix would look like in the case of a partially observable Markov model. So, during inference, when you are figuring out what the parameters are using the Baum-Welch algorithm, this is useful to keep in mind. Okay. So, now that we do not know, so I told you that finding the number of hidden states is actually a hard problem, right, knowing how many states to pick. There are various things that people try. Okay. Most people who build these models, given their context, have to actually figure out an algorithm that works in their case. Okay. So, one way to do this might be you start with think of just some space in which the models are. You can maybe start with a Markov model, okay, and using Baum-Welch you figure out what the log likelihood of the sequence is given the model, and then you can change the number of states in the model, right. So, you could perhaps say, okay, I am going to add a state to one of the symbols in the model. So, let us say this is just a 3-state model, I am going to add something here, and then so you move up, right. So, you add a state to one of the syllables, depending on which one you add it to, you might be in a different location, and in each case you use Baum-Welch and find what the likelihood of that model is given your observation sequence, and see if that likelihood is greater than what you had before. So, is it better than a Markov model if you add one state to that particular syllable? So, this is a grid search, just a grid search algorithm that may be a way of picking how many states to assign to each syllable in the model. That is one thing to do, but it is not a very good algorithm. So, you will get stuck in this. So, maybe the order in which you add states may matter. In any of these instances, you are never guaranteed of a global optimum. Okay. Okay. Now, if you have by let us say some means, we will start with this basic idea now that you have a way of figuring out what the states are. How do you then say whether beyond the log likelihood, are there other ways in which people talk about whether the model is a reasonable one or not? You can look at the sequence statistics and then see, is this model reasonable? So, for example, you could look at these distributions, right from the sequences. So, the song of the bird has these repeats. So, each syllable may be repeated multiple times before a new syllable is sung. And there is some statistics to these repeats, right, if you look at all songs. And you could just look at the repeat distribution. So, this is just the histogram would tell you, with what probability each repeat number occurs. And you might want to match the distribution you get from the observed sequences with what you would get from a model. So, you build a model, given a model you can generate sequences from the model, right. So, you can generate sequences from the model, see what the statistics of those sequences are and match it against what you observe in your actual data set, and that might be one way of seeing, is your model reasonable or not. So, here is just repeat distributions. So, that's the black is from songs from a Bengalese finch, and the blue is from a Markov model. If you generate sequences and build these distributions, what does the fit look like, right. So, whenever there are peaks, for example, a Markov model will not be able to capture that in a repeat distribution, okay. And then we will ignore this. It's some other model, but here we will just look at a partially observable Markov model with adaptation for the repeats, okay. It is just for the repeat structure, and you could check something like this. You could also check n-gram distributions. So, this is done in linguistics work also. So, n-grams would be, you take a 2-gram would be all subsequences of length 2, right. And you ask in the data set what are the subsequences of length 2 that you see, what is the identity of these sequences, and then given your model you generate sequences and again test the two distributions against each other, okay. So, that idea continues. You could also, so repeats, these are the typical ones that you look at in these symbol sequences, repeat distributions, n-gram distributions, and then you can also look at what is called the step distribution, saying what step, any particular syllable, what step from the beginning or the end of the sequence do you find it, right. Do you find it at the second step, do you find it at the fifth step? You could build that distribution and again check it against what you get from the model, okay. How is it different from the repeat? So, the repeat distribution you only look at, if I take the syllable A, how many times does it repeat twice? How many times does it repeat 3 times? How many times does it repeat 4 times? So, that is what forms the repeat distribution, right. With the step distribution you would ask the syllable A, how many times does it appear at position 1 from the beginning, at position 2 from the beginning, and so on. So, that is the step distribution, all right. Okay.
They look qualitatively the same, right? All the curves.
Which ones? The when you say all the curves?
Those are the predictions, right?
The blue, green and the red. Yeah. So, sure. So, it's just a question of like a better fit. The one that really matters for the Markov model, whether Markov model is able to capture features, is the repeat distribution. So, any kind of peaked repeat distribution a Markov model will not be able to capture. Yeah, and n-gram distributions you can quickly see it deteriorate. That is right. So, yeah.
They look the same.
No,
Almost.
Red is hugging the black curves much more closely than the other.
Oh, there are black curves behind the.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah. So there are, yeah.
I see black somewhere, but that's something.
Okay, so the black is from the data,
Yeah.
and then the blue, the green and the red are from the model, sequences generated from the model. So, I thought you meant that the general shape looks the same, but yeah.
Across the row.
Yeah, but the fit is what you need to look at.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, so far we have just said if you have a model, here are some ways of one thinking about the number of states in the model and also looking at statistics to see whether the model is reasonable or not. Let us now do this in a more principled way. So, let us go back to why Markov models may be incompatible with certain sets of sequences. So, Annika, last time you said, oh, you see context dependency, right. So, let us talk about that idea of context dependency. So, here there is an example, these are, let us say you have just these two observed sequences, each found with probability like 0.5, and you generate a Markov model, first order Markov model given these sequences, okay. So, the problem here of course is overgeneralization. The model predicts unobserved sequences. Okay. So, that is the issue here. This is the only kind that we talked about. Why do we think of this as context dependence? Because C goes to D only if preceded by A and not by B, right. That is the context dependence in this case. Okay. So, we are not able to capture that with a simple Markov model. So, now what might be a measure, like a simple measure that allows us to get at this, right, whether this kind of overgeneralization is happening. So, you could simply look at the total probability that the model generates all of the sequences in the observed set. So, if these are the number of m is the number of capital M is the number of unique sequences, you could just add up those probabilities in your actual data set. Okay. So, if if the model was very good and it only generated the sequences that are observed in the data set, you would see PC to be 1. Okay. All right. The second kind of context dependence is, let us take another example. So, ACD, ACE, BCD and BCE, and again first order Markov model. So, now these two sequences are also present, right, BCD and BCE in the observed set. But what are you not able to capture? So, you have just the sequences that you have in the observed set, you are able to get all of them and not only all of them with the model. What are you not able to capture? Yeah, the correct frequencies, right. So, you are not able to capture that. This is another kind of context dependence, because depending on whether C is preceded by A or B, how often it transitions to D or D changes. Okay. So, the second type of context dependence, it is a question of a probability mismatch, right. The model predicts the wrong probabilities. So, if we want to fix that, one thing to, or not fix it, something that could keep track of this probability mismatch is just looking at the variation distance, is just a measure of difference in probabilities. So, what you do is you look at the probability of any particular sequence in the observed set, and then you look at the normalized probability of that sequence given the model and just the difference between the two. Okay. So, if it was a really good model, D would be just okay. All right. So, you have these two, and then we can combine them into like just a simple composite measure, putting these two together, and beta is just thought of as the weight to this variation distance here. Okay. So, PC is more forgiving because its probabilities, it is more forgiving. So, you want it to be weighted less compared to the other. Okay. So, beta is a value between 0 and 1, and you can pick this for the kinds of models that you are building. You actually have to play around and see what works well. For most sequences, beta does not really matter too much, except if it is really close to 0 or really close to 1. Okay. So, here now we had these models earlier. Just look at this region at the bottom of each in this figure. Okay. So, now that you have these two measures, sequence completeness, variation distance and P beta, which is the composite measure, you can see that for this one, the sequence completeness, it does not get half of the sequences right. This one it gets all of the sequences right, but the so this is the partially observable Markov model. Instead of a Markov first order Markov model, you build a partially observable Markov model with C being represented by two states here, and that takes care of this problem of overgeneralization, and you can see that PC is 1 for this simple model. Right. The second one, where there is a probability mismatch, again let us say you build, instead of a first order Markov model, you build a partially observable Markov model. Okay. So, two states again for C. Again you can look at the measures to get a sense of whether this is a better model than the first order Markov model using the measures that we've built so far. So this is the idea. Okay. So how do you actually infer a POM, right? Earlier I told you you could use grid search and things like that, but that's very dependent on which syllable you decide to add a state to, in what order you decide to add states and so on. Again, this is just one other way to perhaps get at building a partially observable Markov model when you don't know the number of states. Okay. So what you can do is the following. It's a reasonable question to ask. Okay, why do you need something like a hidden Markov model or a partially observable Markov model? Why not, instead of a first order Markov model, maybe you want a second order Markov model or a third order Markov model, which means that each observation is influenced by an observation 2 steps before it or 3 steps before it, right, fixed length. So these are higher order Markov models. Okay. So what we do is actually the following. So you actually start by constructing higher order Markov models. You take the observed sequence, suppose this is the observed sequence, alpha means start and omega means end, and then you collect unique subsequences of length m, whatever m is, and also all subsequences up to length m that start from alpha. So if you are looking at m being 2, if you build a second order Markov model, so you have alpha a, c, d, omega, and you pick m equals 2. So starting from alpha up to m equals 2, so there is alpha, alpha a, ac, cd and d omega. So you look at these subsequences, and what you do is turn each of these into a state in the model. Okay, and the state gets labeled. Remember, you have this mapping from one state to one symbol. So this state gets, of course, mapped to symbol alpha. This gets mapped to the symbol A. This one gets mapped to the symbol C, what it ends with, this to D, and this to omega. That would be the idea. Okay. So subsequences, omega is of course the end state and alpha is the start state. Okay. So this is the final syllable of each subsequence serves as the symbol for that particular state. So you are actually looking at transitions of length 2, right, if you look at m equals 2. And you can look at higher order transitions as well. Okay. So you try m equals 2, m equals 3, and you build POMs in each case. How do you calculate the transition probabilities? Easy, just as in a first order Markov model. You know these subsequences, you look at the actual data and count the number of times transitions happen between these subsequences of length 2. Okay. All right. So the POM that you actually infer by this method is equivalent to an mth order Markov model, to a higher order Markov model. But this is complex, right? So, for each symbol to have many states, like multiple states, once you do that, you'll have too many to handle. And so you think of a scheme to actually simplify the model by merging and deleting states that are associated with the same syllable. Okay. So you take suppose you have 2 states that are associated with the same syllable. So you look at the probability distributions of subsequent sequences and then you merge these states. Okay. So there is some merging scheme basically, and you then check, after merging this, you check p beta. Okay. And you see how good the model is, and you continue this till no further mergers happen. And all state transitions with probabilities that are really, really small are eliminated. Okay, so you have some model, but it's not really optimal. Once you do the state merging and pruning and so on, you use that as the beginning of your Baum-Welch algorithm. So you take that structure and then use Baum-Welch to optimize it. So at that point, what you will have is not the same number of states for each syllable, So you have a chance of getting at how many hidden states may be representing each syllable. Okay. All right. So how do we test this? This is just an example. So suppose we build this model, right? Just a toy model, and we think of this as the ground truth model. Okay. This is what you're trying to infer. Let's say you begin by inferring a Markov model. So you start, and this is the Markov model that you build. Once you have this model, you can actually generate sequences from this model. Okay. You can also calculate p beta, okay, given this model here, and because you can generate finite number of sequences, right? So from each model you can generate 10 sequences or 30 sequences or 90 sequences, and you want to understand if you just have a very small set, does that in fact affect the inference, right? Because, and this is relevant also to birdsong, because you are not guaranteed to have many songs, right? Later I will show you that one question you can ask is, if a bird is deafened, what can you see about the syntax of song, right? And so under these conditions you may not always have a large number of sequences to work with. You're always working with a finite set, and it's important to establish that just the finiteness of the data set is not actually, I mean, how does it affect the inference? Okay. So, this red line that you see is the p beta that you get from the model, okay, and this is what you get by generating multiple sequences from the ground truth model. So there is some process that is generating sequences, that's the assumption, and you have 10 of those sequences, okay, and using 10 of those sequences you are inferring a model, and you are asking how good is that model. So that model has this red p beta here, and if you generate like a 10,000 sets of 10 sequences each, you can build a distribution of p betas for that set, right? And you ask this red line here, this value of p beta that you get from your model, where does it lie with respect to this distribution? So little p here is the probability that the observed p beta actually exceeds the p beta values of the generated sets. So if it is less than 0.05, then you know that it's unlikely to have been drawn from this distribution. Okay. So just look at these values. Here you will not be able to, because p is 0.3, you will not be able to reject this model. So with 10 sequences you cannot reject the model. With 30 sequences, you will, by your scheme, you will reject the model, you will reject the Markov model. Okay, it gets better as the number of sequences is more, as you would expect. So that's the scheme to use, and you can check this by inferring POMs of, for various. So this was just a Markov model to explain the idea to you. You can infer POMs from each of these data sets of various lengths, and every time you infer it, you may have slight variation, right? So you can ask in each case, how many states do you see? The state multiplicity, which is what we are after. What do you see, right? And for out of these, 100 trials and so on, you see that there isn't a large variation in the number of states that you get for the model. So we are okay. Our problem was that we didn't know how to say how many hidden states are there. Hidden states are important in our model because we are correlating it to the Sinfire chains in the neural model. Okay. All right. So we have this. This is yeah.
Markov model, the partially observable Markov model might be different, but the number of states is still this. Hidden states is still the
same. That's right. Yeah. Might be, yeah. So it might be slightly, because you could have different sets of transition probabilities, slightly varying transition probabilities, giving you the same observed, giving you the same set of sequences. Yeah. Okay. So what do we have right now? We just have a scheme for given a set of sequences, building a partially observable Markov model or or a hidden Markov model, specifically a
number of models that you can infer will also go down.
If you increase the number of sequences that you have,
In
the
the
number of
then the number of inferred models would also reduce, right? The possible inferred models.
why is that?
No, I'm asking.
Oh.
Is that the case that it would go down?
No, I mean, and when you say go down, do you mean that, okay, if you generate 100 of them, you would see that some proportion of them are all the same? Like, what would you mean by going, the number of models goes down?
If I have more sequences in the data, it would put a constraint on the partially observable Markov's models. Right?
That's right.
I can't have all possible models.
That's right. But so I'm just trying to think of just this idea that, I mean, I don't know like how many sets of them look similar both in terms of states and transition probabilities.
In the sense that you might expect some minimal number of sequences from the data to make a right inference about the original Markov round 2.
Okay.
But here you're saying that you can have different inferred Markov models.
You can have, yeah, so given the same set of sequences, when you infer a model, for example, here I tell you what the total number of states is, but what gets assigned to which syllable may be slightly different, right? Or the transition probabilities may be slightly different. So I'm trying to think of how do I say that, the sets of models that you may be inferring are smaller.
So somehow the number of states converges faster than the model itself. The explicit model that you.
Maybe we talk about it later. Maybe I'm not getting something that you're saying. Yeah. Okay, alright, so we have a scheme to also test the model. What do we do with these models, right? How do you actually use it with, let's say, experimental data and so on? So, here is one example of what can be done. So, this is in an experiment where we were looking at Bengalese finches, and that's the group that I got data from. They had the songs of the bird before deafening, and then they had the songs of the bird after deafening. So the idea is that auditory feedback can have a role in what songs get sung. Right? So when we hear ourselves speak, it affects the way we speak. Right? So auditory feedback perhaps has a role in what kinds of songs are generated. And so if you remove auditory feedback, do you see something about the syntax of the songs changing? That's the question to ask. So which means you need to have a way to get at the syntax and then map it to what sort of neural mechanism may also support what you see. Okay? So these are just a few results to indicate some ideas. This is the syntax model, a partially observable Markov model. You can see the state multiplicity before deafening. This is the model after deafening. Okay? So you see one of the things that you notice is a reduction in state multiplicity, okay, in most of the cases that you look at. Okay. So that's one thing that happens. The redundancy in states goes down, right? The state multiplicity goes down. The song becomes more Markovian post deafening. The other thing that you see is if you look at the number of extra, so this is what I told you, the number of extra states goes down post deafening. The transition entropy, okay, what this goes up, what this would mean is that there are a lot of these novel transitions that appear after deafening. There are more kinds of transitions, many of them with really low probability that appear after deafening. Okay. So, these are the kinds of things that you could do once you can build a model of the syntax. Okay. Now, how does it all tie back to where we started in that first tutorial? So, this idea that for the same syllable C, you have a neural representation, right? So, one way of thinking about it is that you have different chains for the same syllable. Okay. Physically different chains for the same syllable. That's one way, that's one possible way this is coded. Another is that actually you don't have different chains, it's just one chain, But what's happening is that depending on what the bird hears, so depending on whether the bird hears A or B, it influences. So there's some there are auditory there are areas in the songbird's brain from which you have the representation of auditory feedback, and so perhaps auditory feedback actually mediates, and that's how you decide, that's how there is a transition from C to D or E. Okay, so that might be a possibility. Now, what we actually see with the data is that for some syllables the state multiplicity actually disappears, but not for all. Okay, it does persist for some syllables. You see the state multiplicity for some syllables. So you need to have some mechanism that explains this, right? That there is a disappearance of state multiplicity for some syllables, but not for others. So one way of saying what might be going on is that, actually there is some hardwiring. Okay, there are multiple chains for some syllables, but maybe for others there is the role of auditory feedback is stronger for some syllables than for others. Okay, so this would explain seeing the loss of state multiplicity for some syllables and not for others. Okay, and then that throws up questions like, okay, which we haven't, for example, looked at what classes. So if you look at the actual acoustic structure, is there something different about the syllables for which there is a state loss, loss of multiplicity, versus ones for which there isn't a loss of state multiplicity. Okay, so working at these two levels, this is where I'll end. So working at these two levels allows you to one is this coupling, hopefully that you've seen a little bit, and allows you to ask questions about both levels, right? And that may be a useful thing to think about. Yeah. So hopefully I gave you a flavor of how this sort of work is done. That's my email ID. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them. And I also wanted you to remember, apart from everything that we did today, and I'll ask you to do an exercise in just a minute, also wanted you to remember that idea of the bird and the frog. Okay, so you should, so there are times when you have to be the bird and times when you have to be the frog. So in learning the math, for example, in these sessions, you have to be frog-like. Okay, but it's also nice to have the bird's eye view of how these things connect and a big sense of what more you could explore.